An Odd Boy, Volume 1, Chapter 2, Part 1. July 1959 to August 1962. Mr. Love. Blues appeared one summer day, not long after Alice went away. I'd just turned 7. I was perched in the branches of a gnarled old willow tree. The willow lived in a wilderness of grass and brambles on a narrow track running down the back of the odd-numbered houses of Woodsfield Lane. The track led into Wayflood Woods, where my brother Graham and I spent a deal of time. When alone, I'd nest myself in a yew tree. I called it the music tree. It had 6 sawn-off branches which emitted different notes if tapped with a stick. I'd sit silently in the yew tree for hours at a time, trying to imagine what it was like being a tree. I played it like a xylophone, and suppose it must have been an ent. My father asked, "What do you do in the woods, Victor?" He had that suspicious expression on his face, and I replied with trepidation that I ran around a lot, doing things that he might consider manly. That made my situation worse, because I had no clear idea what such things might be. He was frightfully keen on my being manly. Sitting in a tree for hours was the kind of thing that would enrage him. I often annoyed him simply by being alive, or so it seemed. I think my father probably just wanted me to be less abnormal in order that I'd eventually be employable. He used to tell me, "You need to be able to punt your own canoe when you grow up." I thought that the children of his previous marriage had somehow failed to do that and were haplessly floating down the river somewhere. I never inquired where the mysterious river went. I'd heard some mention of people being sold downriver or sold upriver in films. It seemed that many disturbing things were connected with rivers and that learning to handle boats was therefore indispensable. I wondered why I never received sailing lessons. I'd asked, but was told they were not possible. I wondered about asking how I would punt my own canoe as an adult if I never received training. I thought better of inquiring further, because the mention of sailing lessons annoyed my father. Wayflood Woods is now a sad, shrunken vestige of what it was. As time went by, increasing incursions were made on it to accommodate housing estates. Now it is entirely domesticated. Trails are paved with tarmac and bridges cover the stream. I was lucky to have had the woods as they were. Few people walked dogs there, let alone strolled around it as if it were a park. Foxes once lived in the woods, as did badgers and other creatures, such as the odd boy. Where do local children go now if they want to go somewhere wild? Children need to be able to perch in trees, silently gazing. My father became annoyed if I sat silently anywhere. I'd always have to be doing something. He'd be irritated if he found me sitting in an armchair, seemingly doing nothing. I wouldn't exactly be doing nothing. I'd be gazing at the colour of the wall. As darkness descended, all kinds of colours wove in and out of the grey of the fading day. I used to try to catch those changes in the moment of their changing. It was an act of extreme vigilance, and mostly I'd find myself having lost attention for a moment. Suddenly there'd been a shift I missed in the violet or indigo within the deepening grey. The shifts were fascinating in their elusiveness. Art was performing itself in front of my eyes. Then my father would ask what I was doing. I'd panic, saying, "I'm thinking." I imagined this would be an acceptable answer, but I'd be wrong. "Go outside and play like proper children," he'd bark. At junctures such as this, I'd take to the lane at the back of the garden. There was a tree there in which I could sit in peace. I'd watch the crows across the narrow lane as they squabbled for roosting space, their black shapes flickering like a manic mosaic. Their movements almost became patterns before fragmenting into cacophonous chaos. The wild, overgrown track proffered glimpses of the back gardens of houses on the odd-numbered side of Woodsfield Lane. Near the bottom of the track lived the Loves, brother and sister. Mr. Love was shell-shocked, according to my father. He was a gentle old fellow with a florid complexion. He wore elegant Evelyn-Waugh clothes. He was courteous, kindly, and cultured. But sometimes he'd mumble to himself in a strange way. He could be a little disturbing to some when he was out of kilter, but otherwise he'd beam at people. He was entirely benevolent and considerate. In later years, I realised that he must have been a little like Lewis Carroll, an easy communicator with children. He was sitting in his garden one time when I was roosting in the willow tree where his garden met the overgrown track. I was listening intently to the music playing on his gramophone. Astonishing music. I'd never heard anything the like of it. As I swayed there on the branch, transfixed by the music, he noticed me. "Yes?" he called out with a smile. "What is it?" I replied in some perplexity, "I don't know." I'd misunderstood him and was searching for the kind of answer that I'd give to my father when caught doing nothing. I took him to be irritated with me, but he'd only meant to ask me what I wanted in a welcoming sort of way. I must have looked expectant or something, and I thought he was wondering whether I was touting for work. Sometimes I chopped old boxes up for neighbours, as I had my own axe. Every Viking needs an axe. He stood up and walked up the garden. I was worried slightly in case he was having one of his turns. "It's the music, Mr. Love," I said, feeling slightly anxious. "I hope you don't mind, but I don't know what it is. I've never heard that music before, and I like listening to it. What is that music, please?" He smiled. "It's blues," he replied, beaming at me. "It's from America. That is why you have never heard it before." I asked him if I would be able to hear it somewhere, and he replied, "People don't listen to music like this in England." Then he laughed quietly. "It's a little too lively. Yes, too lively. I asked, "Is it all right then if I stay in the tree and listen?" Mr. Love laughed gently and replied, "We can do better than that, young Victor. You can come into the garden and sit with me. I can tell you about this music, if you like." Fantastic. I'd like nothing better in the entire world. "Yes, please, Mr. Love, I would like that very much indeed," I replied eagerly. I descended from the willow tree and sat near him in a raggedy old orange and blue striped deck chair with a delicate woodworm tracery in the frame, listening to crackling 78 records of Big Bill Broonzy. He brought out glasses of ginger beer that his sister had made. It was delicious. I'd never tasted ginger beer before, but Mr. Love provided it whenever I visited. I somehow conceived of it as the thing that bluesmen drank. What a voice that man had! "Who is that man?" I asked, and Mr. Love told me all about Big Bill Broonzy. Who'd ever heard of a person having such a name? The 3 B's together were magic. Mr. Love told a long story and illustrated it by playing different gramophone records. It was like being in school, but as school ought to be, not school as it was. "I want to sing like Big Bill Broonzy," I proclaimed with joy. Mr. Love replied, "That is entirely possible if you practice singing, but you will have to see what happens when your voice breaks. You might not be able to sing as low as Mr. Broonzy. Not everyone has that kind of voice." I asked if it would be painful when my voice broke. Mr. Love laughed gently and replied, "Dear me, no. Dear me, no. That is just a term for the voice changing. Nothing breaks. Your voice will change when you are 12 or 13. Your voice will become lower then, and you will see whether you become a tenor, baritone, or bass." Mr. Love went on to elaborate on what these vocal ranges were, and I told him I hoped I'd be a bass. "I hope you will. I hope you will. And," he added, "by the sound of your voice now, I would say that it's certainly not impossible." That became my big hope. I started wondering how I could encourage the bass voice to appear rather than the higher ranges. I certainly didn't want to be a tenor. That would be terrible. Mr. Love said he knew of nothing that made a difference. "I think one's voice is like one's height and the colour of one's eyes. We have to be content with what we are given," he continued. "I am a tenor, and I cannot reach the deep notes that Big Bill Broonzy reaches." I said I was sorry and wondered if his voice might not break again. Mr. Love found that highly amusing. "That is most kind and thoughtful of you, but the voice only breaks once, and I am content to be a tenor. There were some fine blues singers who were tenors, you know. Robert Johnson was a tenor." I pondered that point. I supposed being a tenor wasn't a complete tragedy. But I'm going to be a bass. Mr. Love's records were all 78s and were stored in brown paper sleeves, some with black text on them. They looked ancient and strangely venerable, and somehow less dated than the LPs of tepid European dance band jazz that I'd seen at the house of a neighbour, Mrs. Barnaby. Mr. Love told me, all the jazz and skiffle music we hear in England today came from black American blues music, but we have watered it down to suit our sensibilities. That was plain. Big Mama Thornton was playing. Yes, this is fantastic. I used to think Bill Haley and the Comets were good, but they sound really awful next to this. Mr. Love chuckled and said, well, I wouldn't quite say awful. That would be going a little too far. They are simply musicians for a different audience. An audience who are not yet ready for blues. Mr. Love always ameliorated my strong opinions, and when I think back on that time, I cannot help but admire his skill as an educator. I was glad I was ready for blues. We're ready for blues, aren't we? I proclaimed. We certainly are, young fella, my lad.